Ms. Anderson. Ms. Anderson, I should repeat, is Global Economy Project Director at the Institute for Policy Studies.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank
Welcome.
you so much for this opportunity. I do believe that inequality is the pressing issue of our time, and I really applaud the committee for giving it this level of attention. And I want to begin by emphasizing what I see as the good news, which is that we have tackled this problem before. A century ago, we had very high levels of inequality, comparable to those we're seeing today. And yet, over several decades, policymakers were able to use fair taxation and effective social programs and build the world's biggest middle class. And I think we have a lot to learn from that experience. At the Institute for Policy Studies, we have particular expertise in one of the key drivers of inequality that hasn't been mentioned yet today, and that is executive compensation. For nearly 20 years, we've been tracking the upward spiral of CEO pay, and I have a lot of indicators in my written testimony, but let me just point out that, for example, the ratio between CEO and worker pay has gone up from 42 to 1 in 1980 to about 325 to 1 in 2010, and the average pay for S&P 500 CEOs now is about $11 million a year. Beyond contributing to inequality, excessive executive compensation is a problem because the chance of hitting these massive jackpots gives executives an incentive to do behaviors that might bump up their short-term profits and expand their own paychecks, but undermine our nation's long-term economic health. In our annual executive excess reports, we've looked at corporate behaviors like tax dodging, like massive layoffs, like risky financial activities, like offshoring jobs. All of these appear to boost CEO pay, but of course they've delivered a body blow to the American middle class. Policymakers should also be concerned about excessive executive pay because extreme inequality within firms is simply bad for business. It's well documented now that when you have extreme gaps between top and bottom earners, that it hurts worker morale and productivity and can increase turnover rates. Now, Congress has recently taken some steps to address CEO pay, and I want to highlight a couple of them. The first is the provision in the Dodd-Frank law that requires companies to now report their CEO to worker pay ratios within their companies. I think this could help encourage corporate boards to narrow these gaps. Unfortunately, there's been a very intense backlash by lobby groups representing CEOs, and the SEC has delayed implementation of this transparency measure. The second executive pay reform I wanted to mention is a rather little-known provision in the TARP legislation that set a cap on the tax deductibility of executive pay at $500,000. There's a similar provision in the health care reform bill just applying to health insurance companies. And I think if we could extend that kind of tax deductibility cap across all corporations, we could get rid of a loophole that now encourages excessive executive pay. Because as it is now, the more companies pay their CEOs, the more they can deduct. Beyond the issue of executive pay, we clearly need a broader agenda to tackle extreme inequality. And I think if you look back at the previous era, it's clear that progressive taxation was one of their most important tools. In my written testimony, I have 3 charts that look back over the past century, and they show that the decades when we had the highest top marginal tax rates were also the decades that had the lowest levels of inequality and the highest levels of economic growth. I end with 7 reforms that I think could help get us back to a healthier level of inequality. And I'd like to highlight just one that I don't think has gotten enough attention here in Capitol Hill, and that's the idea of putting a very small levy on each trade of stocks and derivatives and other financial instruments. A financial transactions tax like that could generate massive revenues while also discouraging the short-term speculation that's been driving up pay in the financial sector, but adding little to the real economy. And so in conclusion, I want to acknowledge that this is going to be a long-term challenge for this country, but we have transformed a highly divided nation into a more stable and equitable one before, and we can certainly do it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.